So the first presentation is about what is this MTBF. I think some fundamentals. The MTBF is part of a strategic budgeting system. About 40, 50 years ago, this orange component was actually not very established in many countries around the world. The budgeting used to start in the budget formulation or detailed budgeting phase. So the ministries were requested to provide budgetary proposals, and the budget was made based on the needs of the ministries. So it was a bottom-up process that many countries followed. But they soon realized that these needs very quickly turn into wishes. These demands become more than what is actually required by the ministries. And hence, the bottom-up budgeting was not found to be very sustainable. So many countries around the world introduced this new phase in the annual budgeting process called strategic budgeting. And we will look at what are the things that are part of this phase. So this particular phase is part of the annual budget, and it is top-down and normally looking at medium term. Now, when we say medium term, many countries look at 3 years, some look at 5 years. America looks at 10 years. There is no standard of what medium term actually mean, but it's 3, 5, or something else. And we will look at some of these statistics on the number of years as well. So once the strategic budget priorities are set, detailed budgeting is undertaken, and then based on that, budget is presented in the parliament. It is then executed, and then audit and evaluation is undertaken. This is the process that most of the countries follow around the world. High income, middle income, even low income. In middle income and low income, the strategic budgeting process is in many cases not as strong as high income countries. And we will look at that very closely in a short while. Now, why this strategic budgeting was introduced? The aim or the issue that it intends to highlight was one, fiscal discipline. Because when you talk about bottom-up budgeting, budget based on the needs of ministries, quickly what is sustainable becomes unsustainable. So in many of these OECD countries in 1970s and 80s, the governments were spending 40, 45, 50% of GDP of budgets. And everyone was asking, this high amount of spending, is it really productive? Is it really worth it? Is it ideal? The reason this 40, 50% is a difficult number to look at is because people have to pay taxes. So the burden goes on the people and firms, and also the countries have to take loans. So in order to reduce burden on loans, reduce burden on taxes, so that people can have more money and firms can invest more, government has to reduce its expenditure. Also reduction of expenditure, but making it more productive. So first objective of this strategic budgeting was fiscal discipline. To comply specifically with some type of rules, fiscal stability laws specifically. So many countries in OECD introduced these fiscal stability laws in 1990s, and many of these developing countries introduced this in early 2000 or later. Now these rules, what are these rules? What are these stability laws? We will look at them shortly. Another aspect of this fiscal discipline is the economic stability and economic growth. We were discussing with our colleague from Fiscal Stability Council yesterday, and because we come from fiscal background, for us, fiscal is the nucleus of economy. Why fiscal is nucleus or the center of the economy? because if government starts spending much more than it has, then debts become unsustainable. In many countries right now, more than 50 countries around the world, the interest expenditure has become so much that the money for investments, government investments, and even service delivery has shrunk. So that's one reason. Another reason is if the government borrows a lot of money, private sector cannot borrow, and hence the government takes more of these resources from the banking sector. Thirdly, if the government starts spending a lot of money, borrowing, it increases overall demand in the economy and it increases imports. And hence, the current account deficit, which is sort of a difference between imports and exports, become unsustainable. If that becomes unsustainable, reserves go down. If reserves go down, automatically currency starts weakening. If currency starts weakening, inflation increases. If inflation increases, it puts more pressure on the government's budget. So it's a budget is a center to this economic management. It is center to our savings. It is center to our purchasing power. It is center to inflation, to interest rates, to exchange rate, and in many cases it is also center to the foreign reserves a country has. So I hope that gives us clarity that budget is a very, very important instrument in economic management. It is not just that the ministries want some money and we give them money and thank you. No, it's much more than that, and it has a macroeconomic impact. Also, budget needs to be looked at from fiscal risks perspective. What if the exchange rate reduces, falls, depreciates? What impact would it have over the medium term? Another question is, what if international commodity prices, let's say coal prices or copper prices, what if they go down? How will that have impact over the medium term on the budget? Those are the very important questions, and for that reason, this stage of strategic budgeting was introduced in many, many countries. The second objective is the budget allocations where the return is the highest, the most productive investments. This strategic budgeting component, because it has this top-down element, not asking all the ministries only, but also bringing in the strategic priorities of the government, the political government, they have their own priorities. And we need to see whether there is fiscal space, whether there is money available, and how these budgets need to be allocated to the ministries so that the political government can be ensured that their vision is being translated into the budget. This strategic budgeting process ensures that. I'm sure you would agree that these two principles or objectives are very, very important in management in a country. So this particular point here, the linkage or alignment between planning and budgeting, let me assure you that this is very easy to write on a piece of paper, but actually very difficult to do. Linking plans with the budgets is a difficult job, and there are many reasons. One reason is that the plans are normally aspirational. They come with huge amount of demand for money. And in many cases, what we see is that these plans are written in the language which is different from the language of the ministries, the way they make the budgets. So there's a difference of language. Both of them cannot easily understand each other. Another very important point is that the decisions that the government takes today on the allocation of budget has an impact tomorrow and day after tomorrow. So that's another issue. Now, this strategic budgeting intends to resolve or address these specific issues. You will ask, but where is this implemented? I'm sure you would ask this question. Actually, it is implemented mostly in high-income countries. Now, middle-income countries have also started working on that, but we normally see very good process, comparatively good process in high-income countries when we compare with, for example, middle-income countries. Another point that I want to say here is that while there are principles of this strategic budgeting that we can look at, let me also assure you that every country has different budgeting, planning, institutional, political systems. We cannot say that what, for example, Australia does, we should do it same here. It's not going to work. We cannot say what Germany does, we need to put that system here. It's not going to work easily. We need to adapt those systems based on context, based on institutions, based on laws, political systems. And hence, what we can do is, in this session, we can learn about some of these things, but I think in session 2, we will talk about what are the changes we need to make in the current system in Mongolia. Otherwise, it's going to be a big change and maybe things would not work. And as I said, the institutional roles and responsibilities are also different. We've also learned that this MTBF is actually not very strong in some of the OECD countries. What is the evidence? The evidence is that the fiscal rules, the stability law, the budget or the ceilings that go to the ministries, and what they actually spend are quite different. These are three different worlds in some OECD countries. And we also see that in medium term, there is also a question mark. What does year 2 and year 3 actually mean? Is that a commitment by the government that we will definitely give that amount of money? In most of the OECD countries, there is no such commitment. So what is year 2 and year 3? That's another question that is being asked in many of these OECD countries. So let's look at the components of the strategic budgeting process that I talked about, the yellow round process. It has two things: before the budget and after the budget, ex ante and ex post. Now, before the budget, there are three things that are common in most of these OECD countries, but please don't think that this is exactly what every country follows. They may have different things, but these are somewhat commonalities. One, most of these OECD countries produce medium-term fiscal framework. I'm sure you would have seen the medium-term fiscal framework on the Parliament's website produced by Fiscal Stability Council. It is about what are the revenues, what are the projections, what are the expenditure limits, what is the debt, and based on that, there are two more indicators, I understand, that are currently being produced, which is GDP and inflation. So that's the first thing that most of the countries do. Number two is that they convert these numbers on the medium-term fiscal framework into some sort of budget strategy. What are the strategic priorities in the budget that will be included when the detailed budgeting will take place? What are those priorities? Are there investment projects? Are there changes in the policy? Are there going to be some areas which will be stopped? This document or this process provides that type of a strategic budget initiative. And we will talk more about this, the budget strategy as well. The third one is the ceilings. Now, these ceilings are both top-down and bottom-up. What does top-down mean? It means that key fiscal institutions, Ministry of Finance, Fiscal Stability Council, Ministry of Economy, etc., they get together and they say, this is the baseline budget that we have to give based on the current policy to the ministry. So the ministry have civil servants. Ministries have to have operation and maintenance. They have these requirements. Either you close them down or you say if they are going to be working, this is the minimum budget that they will need. So that's one other process of determining what is the baseline and then how do you bring in political priorities in change of policies. That's the other one. Now these countries in many of these OECD countries, it's not only budget formulation process that's very strong, it's actually budget evaluation that is also very strong. So these countries also undertake evaluation of what have been the budgetary differences, deviations. Why the budget was not according to the fiscal framework. Why the budget deviated, or the actual expenditure deviated from the budget limits. And then many of these OECD countries have now also started the sector or the spending reviews. Is Ministry of Health providing value for money? Is Ministry of Education doing the best to improve learning outcomes for children? Is agriculture focusing on resilience? Are renewables, is there an energy transition that is being taken place, and how the budget is being used on these key development outcomes? So that's another process, very, very intensive process, and many, many types of capabilities are undertaken on this. This happens every year. In certain cases, the spending reviews are undertaken after maybe 2 or 3 years. Now we see that in many countries, this process is stronger as compared to this ex-post process. So most of the focus goes on the budget making, but increasingly now there is a focus on ex-post evaluations. Why things are not working. In terms of these fiscal rules, the medium-term fiscal framework, it is normally based on some sort of legal framework. You have fiscal stability law, and that, to my understanding, prescribes 4 types of fiscal rules. One is the expenditure limit, one is the debt limit, one is the budget deficit limit, and I think the 4th one is revenue related. But please correct me if I'm wrong. These are the sort of 4 things. Many countries in OECD have these types of rules, laws. Certain cases they work, certain cases they don't work, because the accountability clauses in many cases are not very strong. So what has happened is in OECD countries, they said, okay, even though we have laws, still there are problems. Things don't work. So they innovated independent fiscal councils. In OECD countries, probably about 80% now have independent fiscal councils. That is in response to the issue of fiscal discipline. The budget was not within the fiscally sustainable requirements, even though there are these fiscal stability laws. And in many cases, there are also now rules related to government guarantees that are being introduced in OECD countries. And these guarantees, I'm sure you would know, impact state-owned enterprises as well. So hence, the overall fiscal framework in many countries also includes government and state-owned enterprises. And when I talk about government, I mean central government, provincial or state level government, and the local government. So many countries are looking at this as an overall, because it's the overall that impacts the economy much more than only one component of it. But that's a bit difficult thing. Now, let's see who prepares these medium-term fiscal framework forecasts. When I say prepare, I mean who is the main responsible organization, because in many of these OECD countries, it's a collaborative effort. It's not just one organization, but who in the laws or rules and regulation is being given the main responsibility to prepare these medium-term fiscal frameworks. In most of these OECD countries, on your left-hand side, you will see number of OECD countries. And we've divided this based on a survey that was undertaken last year between macroeconomic forecasts. Macroeconomic forecasts include GDP, inflation, fiscal numbers, but also current account numbers, in certain cases, interest rates, exchange rate, etc., etc. So that's the macroeconomic. And in many countries, there are also a requirement for revenue forecasts to be undertaken. And we'll also look at one example. Now, we normally see that in OECD countries, it's the Ministry of Finance that is given the responsibility to prepare these main responsibility to prepare these medium-term fiscal framework forecasts. In some countries, some other ministries are also given responsibility. But fundamentally, we see Ministry of Finance there. In some countries, fundamentally, it's the Independent Fiscal Council. But you have to understand that even though most of the OECD countries have independent fiscal councils, they have a very, very important role to play. And I'll talk about that very, very important role shortly. Let's look at an example. I'm sorry I have to give an example from these OECD countries. But what they do is they have developed a working committee, and that working committee comprises of Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economic Affairs, Climate, even Central Bank, Statistics Office, Research Institutes, Economic Advisors. They all get together and provide revenue forecasts 2 times a year. So once before the budget, once during the budget. I think this may be a useful lesson because for resource-rich countries, oil, copper, maybe iron, maybe gold, there may be changes in these international commodity prices that may impact the government's revenues. Maybe that's a good process, but that's an option. We can't really say it's going to work here as well. Now, as I said, independent fiscal councils are very, very important organizations because these countries realized very quickly that the legal instruments are not working properly. So they introduced independent fiscal councils. Now, what do they do in OECD countries? They assess whether the government who has provided these forecasts, are these reasonable? So they give an independent opinion. So in many of the cases in OECD, the independent fiscal council say the government budget is X percentage more than it should be. They give an independent opinion and say this is fiscally sustainable or fiscally unsustainable. This is the opinion given by independent fiscal councils. That happens in 16 countries out of about 30. Now, in many countries, these independent fiscal councils also publish ex post evaluation. Okay, the government has spent this much amount of money. This will have medium-term implications on inflation, on interest rates, on exchange rates, on sustainability of the budget, on debts, on your future revenues, etc., etc. So they provide an ex post evaluation. They also, in many cases, produce alternative forecasts. So, for example, in UK, the Office of Budget Responsibility provides an alternative forecast. So when the finance minister is making a speech in the parliament, he or she says that these are our forecasts. By the way, our fiscal council, the Office of Budget Responsibility, has provided different forecasts. Or he or she says that actually they are same. And we see that in some countries there are differences. In some countries, in certain areas, they may be same. But this is a very important independent function undertaken by independent fiscal councils. As I said, the prime responsibility of preparing these macroeconomic forecasts in OECD countries is primarily related to, given to Ministry of Finance. Now, the question is how these fiscal rules or the legal framework is enacted in OECD countries. In a number of countries, it's the constitution that says that there should be a budget balance or budget deficit limit. In many, many areas, you can see it's the law, just like we have here in Mongolia, a fiscal stability law that prescribes these rules. And as I said, there are 4 types of rules: budget balance, debt, expenditure, revenue. In certain other cases, it is also government guarantees. There needs to be 2 types of rules related to government guarantees: the yearly flow of guarantees and the stock of guarantees. So there are two types of rules in certain countries. However, the overarching lesson from around the world now is simplify them. 1. 2, these rules should be in direct control of the executive, especially Minister for Finance. So if, for example, the fiscal rule says a percentage of GDP, yeah? Now, is GDP really under the direct control of Minister for Finance? If international prices reduce, or if there is international recession going on, or if the trading partners, their economies go down, is it really Minister for Finance's fault? So hence, some people argue that these should not be percentage of GDP, these should be definitive nominal numbers. But then others say, actually what matters is, for comparison purposes, the percentage of GDP. So there's a debate going on. Even in EU right now, there is a debate going on, what should be the fiscal rules? Because under the direct control, fiscal stability, debt stability, needs of the political government in enhancing the expenditure, they all are interrelated matters. So hence, what is a good fiscal stability law is a question. But mostly it is part of the legal instrument, and in certain cases, the government strategy papers or policy documents also provide this. Now, in terms of these rules, we normally see that these rules relate to budget balance, debt, expenditure, and revenue. Most of these OECD countries have these 4 types of rules. In some cases, it's budget deficit or surplus, it is debt and expenditures. I understand, so where do we lie here? Is Mongolia is over there? Do we have 4 types of fiscal rules? Is this where we have in Mongolia, or is it here? It's either one of these two. I think there are probably more than 2 fiscal rules or fiscal limits in here. Now, in order to reduce the bias in forecasts, what do these OECD countries do? Most of them publicly disclose the forecasts in the budget books. So it's part of the budget books, these forecasts, the fiscal forecasts, the medium-term fiscal framework specifically. A number of these countries also provide risks. So the risk statement is given in the budget books. What are the risks that can happen if the government tries to reduce revenue or tries to increase expenditure too much? If that happens, what are the risks that will happen over the medium term? Many OECD countries have divided the power between institutions. So the central bank has its own power. In many cases, they are autonomous. Ministry of Finance has its own autonomy. Standing committees of the parliament has its own autonomy. And the exchange rate is given to the markets to determine. So as soon as the government does anything that is fiscally imprudent or irresponsible, the exchange rate depreciates immediately. So in UK, for example, the Prime Minister Liz Truss came up with a recommendation that there should be reduction in income tax rates. And because of which, of course, the revenue goes down, expenditure remains same, budget deficit increases. Everybody knows that this theory leads to increase in pressures on the external side, leads pressure on the inflation, and hence immediately markets devalue pound to the dollar. Yeah? So if there is an independent exchange rate mechanism, the markets respond immediately to the decisions of the government. And hence, the people stand up and say, what is happening? Why our purchasing power is going to be eroded by the government's own fiscal problems? So I hope you understand that actually reducing fiscal deficit is not an easy thing. It requires many, many different things. Fiscal rules, independent fiscal councils, in certain cases, market-determined exchange rates, autonomous central banks. So these are sort of components of fiscal discipline. Otherwise, fiscal discipline doesn't happen easily. It's a very difficult thing. How do you convince politicians to reduce expenditure? Very difficult. In many countries, they also disclose what are the assumptions behind these numbers. So, for example, the Fiscal Stability Council, if it has come up with a fiscal framework, in these countries they say, what were the assumptions did you use? I think a number of informations are also provided by Fiscal Stability Council. Assumptions include prices of commodities. Assumptions include, for example, what are the assumptions related to main trading partners? What are the assumptions related to inflation, exchange rate, etc., etc. So a number of these countries provide that. And there's also, as I said, a formal role written in the government's rules and the regulations and legal related to independent fiscal councils in these countries. Now, most of this information is actually presented to the parliament. Let's see what these OECD countries present to the parliament. Many countries present macroeconomic assumptions in the budget books. Almost all of OECD countries. What are the fiscal policy objectives? What does fiscal policy actually is trying to do? That's also presented in the budget books. And the budget priorities. So I want you to please remember these budget priorities, macroeconomic assumptions, and also this second one, which is the fiscal policy objectives. These are the three, as you can see, most of the countries present that. These are the three important areas that need to be presented or made public or made transparent. There are also now countries who are presenting tax expenditures. What are tax expenditures? These are exemptions and concessions provided by the government to companies, individuals, and what is the amount of revenue foregone. Because concessions, exemptions essentially reduce government's revenues. So in a number of cases, that is also provided to the legislature so that they know, and the public should know, how much revenue is foregone because of government's own exemptions and concessions. Now, in most of the cases, these OECD countries also have expenditure ceilings. Now, these are restrictions on the expenditures that can be made by the ministries, and these related to, these sort of limits. And in certain cases, they are explicit commitments, especially related to year one. The year one commitment, and it's a top-down process, and as I said, in many cases, it's 3 to 5 years. But generally, we see these are rolling plans, rolling every year for the next 3 years, every year for the next 3 years. So this year, for the next 3 years, and the next year, another year is added, and 1 year is reduced. So it's a rolling, so as to understand how economy is performing and what should be the fiscal policy in a country in order to enhance or improve economic development. I think that's a very important point to see. Now, we see that these ceilings, which are given by Ministry of Finance to the ministries, mostly they are given to the ministries every year for either next year or over the medium term. And mostly they are indicative in nature, which means that the government, the Ministry of Finance, can also change them later on. But because of policy consistency, in many cases we see that the Ministry of Finance honors its commitment that this amount of budget will be made available to the ministries. Why is commitment or that sort of thing is important? It is important because predictability is central to service delivery. Predictability is central to provision of services and for building infrastructure. Let's look at some of the country examples. As we can see that in a number of countries, you can see T means the budget year. So the budget year and the future years, we can see that in most of these countries, they provide ceiling or commitment to the ministries for 1 year only, which is part of the annual budget. In certain countries, they provide commitment for up to 3 years. And in America, we can see that actually on indicative nature, I'm sorry, you might not be able to see, but on indicative nature, they provide some indication for up to 10 years, including the current budget year. So there are vast amounts of differences of how these ceilings are communicated to the ministries. Now you will ask how these ceilings are actually set. In many countries, the ceilings are set by the central organizations at the total expenditure level. So it's the aggregate expenditure, which I think is currently undertaken through the Fiscal Stability Council's medium-term fiscal framework. So there is a number related to total expenditure. So as you can see, a number of countries only provide that for 1 year. A number of other countries look at 2 years or 3 years into the future to see what is the medium-term implication. I think my understanding is that the Fiscal Stability Council prepares the 3 years forecast. Hence, as you can see, at the total aggregate number, there are many OECD countries who do exactly the same. At the organization level, ministry level, governor level, so many countries provide medium-term ceilings, saying that, over the next 3 years, this is the rough amount we guarantee that will be provided to you. Please adjust your policies, plans, procurements, etc., according to these overall numbers. In some countries, for example, UK, they only provide commitment at the ministry level for 1 year. In some very few countries, the budget ceilings are provided at program level. Budget programs, I don't know whether you know about them, but budget programs are just underneath budget governors. These are the main areas of expenditure, and this is based on program-based budgeting, which is a separate topic, a detailed topic. We can have that separately. But I think you can see here that in many cases there are differences, but it's actually the commitment by the central organizations. So let's summarize. OECD countries have actually evolved their budgeting processes. There is no one single best practice. The countries keep on evolving their systems. They change based on their political, administrative, budgetary, growth, fiscal requirements. So there are different processes, but there are some commonalities. There has been a considerable effort, at least over the past 30, 40 years, as I said earlier, on improving fiscal discipline. It's a central part. Politicians want to spend more money and do not want to tax their constituencies. It's the same everywhere in the world. In order to have that fiscally responsible stance, many of these OECD countries have actually focused on improving the fiscal discipline as the central part of budgeting. And for that, they have introduced these laws, rules, independent fiscal councils, as I said, independence of central bank, or maybe market-determined exchange rates. Those are some of the things that they have done. Of course, there are differences in checks and balances between the legislature and the executive in these countries. So there, the parliaments are much more stronger. So for example, let me give you an example in France. In France, the government didn't say we want results-based budgeting or budgeting that is linked with key performance indicators. It's the parliament who said, the budget numbers that you present to us, it doesn't make any sense. What do these numbers mean? What is the outcome? How will it improve development? How would it improve transition from, let's say, climate to renewables, climate harmful areas to renewables. What is the path? What is the strategy? How would I measure the performance of ministries, whether they are working on a particular strategy? It was the parliament who said it, not the government. So, parliaments in many of these OECD countries are actually very, very strong. And the parliamentary standing committees is where the real business of budgets, policies, evaluations take place. There is no single process, but there are certain principles. System of checks and balances, as I said, between the executive and legislature is much better in high-income countries as compared to middle-income countries because of the history, because of the way they have improved their governance processes. In many cases, they've also undertaken political level reforms, how elections should take place, etc., but that's a separate discussion. Another important point is the culture of these ex-post evaluations. Many of these OECD have very, very strong ex-post evaluation culture, which normally we don't see in developing countries. There is also a considerable amount of focus on transparency. Information is generally available to the public. And as I said, these are the elements of the key areas of strategic budgeting. It includes ex-ante and ex-post processes. These are the key messages. This is what OECD's countries do. Maybe what we can do is, have a sort of a dialogue now, a discussion now, to understand, well, okay, what are the key elements of these global practices that may be beneficial for us in Mongolia? I'm not saying they should be implemented, but what can be those areas that may be beneficial? And if they are beneficial, in your opinion, what can be the key challenges that you foresee? Can we have maybe a discussion, if you want to make any point? And for that, the presentation that I just gave is available here. Just click here and you will be able to see the presentation so that you can go through the same areas that we just talked about. Some of these practices, in your opinion, what are some of these good things that we can learn from these OECD countries? You may say, we cannot learn anything because they are different countries, but there are some commonalities. Yeah, so can I request you to maybe download this presentation that I just gave? Just very quickly glance through it. Maybe we take 2 or 3 minutes, and then I would request somebody to make maybe a few points on what can we learn. After the tea break, we will see what is the process here in Mongolia and what can be the options specifically to address within the Mongolian context. Okay, so maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Please download the presentation and have a look at these statistics that we just talked about. What are the elements that we can learn from?